culture is organized around that which it worships, that which it places as highest, that which is its highest value. And cultures are going to be better or worse to the degree that they conform to what is true, right? So you could have a culture that is toxic because it could place and inculcate really bad things, really evil things as the highest value, like racial purity, for example. If that is the highest value in your culture around which everything is organized, you're going to have a culture. People are going to be united around that ideal, but the culture is going to be terrible.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Max.
This is Joey.
And on today's episode, we have an awesome topic for you all. A topic that I think we've had a talk. Well, so I recorded a talk that I gave to a university before on this topic.
This was a while ago.
I'm excited about this topic. It changed my life.
It's a good topic.
It's one of my favorite topics by one of my favorite philosophers, leisure. And there's a lot surrounding this topic. I think that as Americans, I think just as a modern people, we hear it and we're like, what? Are we just trying to be lazy? Are we trying to not work?
Yeah.
We should be working.
Yeah.
We should be doing things, right? But leisure, I think, proposes a new vision of reality. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about today.
I'm excited. It should be good. I finally listened to Max, and he convinced me to read this book that we're going to be talking about today, and turns out he gets something right every once in a while. This book was pretty good. So
also, can we be honest, Joey?
Let's be honest.
You've read some of this book before. This isn't your first exposure to it. So as much as I would like to take credit for my wisdom imparted on him.
No, you were the one who recommended this book to me. I had never heard of it before.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. This was a couple of years ago.
Then I'll accept all of the credit that I deserve.
Take it while you can.
Thank you. Thank you, Joey. I appreciate you.
If you're new to Logos Podcast, welcome. We're glad you're here. Max and I are seminarians studying to be Roman Catholic priests, and this podcast is all about sharing the goodness and beauty and richness of the intellectual and spiritual tradition of the church with you. So we're really glad you're here. Thanks to all
and with each other, as you just found out.
And with our that's right. We learn things from each other every once in a while. So no, very regularly we do, which is part of what makes this so awesome. To our longtime listeners, our patrons, thank you so much for your continued support, for listening to us. We are praying for you. We just prayed for you 5 minutes ago, and we continue to pray for you. Happy Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul. We're recording this on January 25th.
Talking about that, you know what came to mind today during our last class? Just kind of an antidote.
What was it? This was during canon law?
This is during canon law course. Right before we got in there, I was thinking, one of the famous depictions of St. Paul's conversion is him falling off the horse.
That's right.
Depicted by Caravaggio.
Who you guys know if you've listened to Logos Podcast.
That's true. Otherwise, you should know. And you can still listen to Logos Podcast to get to know him. That's beside the point. So there's this famous depiction of him. And, I like horses. I like riding horses. I don't know if I've mentioned it on the podcast before. But
Max is a horse guy.
I like horses. Falling off a horse would hurt.
I've almost done it.
I forgot about that, dude.
In Mexico, but that's a story for another day. But continue. Yes,
that's it. Falling off a horse would hurt.
All right.
So he's depicted raising his hands, and the cynic in me was like, well, maybe he was just like in pain, so he was just reaching out. Maybe there's nothing theological about it. I know there is. Exactly, my back.
Also, the scripture's saying nothing about a horse.
Exactly. Which is another interesting depiction that I was thinking about. I was like, why a horse?
Is it reasonable that he was riding a horse? Maybe
more like a donkey.
People walked a lot.
They did. This is what we're told.
Dude, before we get into this episode, how are you? How's life?
Good, man. Chilling.
What's the best thing that's happened to you today?
The best thing that's happened to me today? That's a good question. I did 3 pages of my MA thesis earlier today.
Wow.
So that's kind of a big deal.
3 down, 42 to go.
Well, actually, I just hit 12 pages.
Oh, nice. Congrats.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
You feel good about it?
I do feel good about it. Well, we'll see. I got to send it to my thesis director, and I'll let you know how that turns out.
That's good. That's exciting.
So anyways, yeah, that's good, man. That's the most exciting thing. Things have been pretty chill. I actually slept in a little bit today. So instead of getting up at 5:30, I got up at 6:15, and it was great.
You feel well rested? So
well rested. Yesterday, I really was not feeling very
weird.
myself.
Me too. I had to sleep in a little bit today too, so I woke up at 3 a.m. instead of 2.
Virtue signaling
Just kidding.
is from the devil.
I woke up, what time? I woke up around 6:15 as well, actually. So, because on feast days, we get a little bit extra time in the morning. So morning prayer is a little later, and then we have mass in the evening. So that's always a little bit of a treat.
Also, talking about treats, we have something new in our studio. which you can't see in the
I
cameras.
wish you could see it
I wish you could.
because it's cool.
But we have an official studio desk, studio table.
Which I built with my own hands.
He did not even help or even think about conceptualizing such a thing as our studio table. But here we have it. And in accordance with the spirit of Joey, which is one of the owners of this podcast, it's a standing desk.
It's a standing table.
And actually, I'm happy.
And it's so cool.
It is awesome. We're pretty tall guys, to be honest with you. So to make a table that fits our stature standing up is pretty impressive.
It's perfect.
It's a 9-foot table, and we're
it looks pretty sweet.
Yeah.
So the studio looks more official, even though you can only see the portion of it that you've always been able to see, if you're even watching us on YouTube, which we recommend.
For sure.
My day's been great. Thanks for asking.
Yes, Joey. Thank you for telling me.
No, I do want to share this. I went to a funeral today this morning I served a funeral mass for a high school classmate, somebody I graduated high school with. His name was Daniel, and he from birth had a serious health condition, so he was in a wheelchair his whole life. And I don't think they were ever expecting him to live very long. So the 26 years he did have were kind of a miracle, and he was just an inspiration to a lot of people. And I went to my home parish, and this was so moving. It was so beautiful. The entire high school football team got out of school, and they lined the courtyard from the parking lot to the church for Daniel's family and his remains to be processed through. And it was and they were wearing their black high school football jerseys. And then, most of them aren't Catholic, and most of the coaches aren't Catholic, but they all came, and it was so beautiful, and it was so moving. And so if you're listening to this, pray for Daniel and his family, and Thanksgiving for his life, but pray for him. That was a blessing of today for sure. Funerals are powerful, man.
Funerals are always powerful.
We're all gonna die.
So you've had a big day, Joey.
Had a big day, and it's not over. I got a cantor mass here in just a couple hours, which I haven't really prepared for, so that should be fun.
He has prepared for.
And it's in Spanish. I haven't prepared for it.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to go to a Bible study tonight at a parish, which is I'm going to take another one of my buddies. So it's a crazy day, but it's good. It's all good stuff.
Just so y'all know, I'm not that buddy. We'll talk about it after.
I would never take Max to a Bible study. Because he already knows everything.
Yeah,
he knows the whole Bible
not
already.
True. Not true. It's so true, dude. Honestly, it's the most true thing you've said ever.
Why are we talking about? Okay, should we mention the book? Should we say the title of the book that we're going to be talking about? So this book, which you've heard Max reference before, you've probably heard me reference it before, which we highly recommend to you, but we're going to be kind of breaking down a little bit, basing this discussion off of, is called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, by a guy named Josef Pieper. Max called him a philosopher. Is he a philosopher? Is he a theologian? Is he both?
A little bit of both.
He's mostly a philosopher, though. I think he's usually categorized in that way. And it's an incredible book. We're going to be just kind of talking about it and then reflecting generally on the concept of leisure, on kind of the Christian worldview that this book inculcates into us or helps us to tap into. And I think it's going to be a great discussion. Before we start, we should ask, as we usually do, why did we choose this topic today?
I think we live in a culture that doesn't know what leisure is. To be honest with you, I think that's primarily the motivation of this episode. Also, we'd mentioned it in one of my most recent classes, actually, regarding this very book. We were talking about kind of a liberal society and kind of a Catholic or a Christian view of the world, and one of the principles by which we engage the world is through this concept of leisure, this leisurely activity. And so it came up in class, and I was like, you know what, we haven't talked about it, on the podcast. I gave the talk, obviously, but not Joey and I talking about this. So that was one of the motivations, I think.
Yeah, leisure is something you need in your life, something I need in my life, something we need in our lives.
Something salvific, actually.
And when we say that, we don't mean what you probably think that we're saying. Namely, we don't mean that you need to be laying on the couch all day, and we'll get into that. But it's a hugely important topic that really is related to our understanding of the human person, our understanding of reality, and it's also super exciting because leisure is awesome.
It is awesome.
Should we talk about, we've mentioned briefly, what are the common misconceptions that you hear when people think leisure, when people are talking about leisure? Like, what do they usually think it is in a way that they're wrong?
I think there's two different extremes that people typically think about it. It's either like you're not doing anything, you're just being lazy, you're sitting on the couch watching Netflix, eating potato chips and ice cream and not doing anything, escaping the real world, and this sort of kind of childish-like behavior. Or the other extreme where like it's an aristocratic activity. Only the person who can sustain their form of life can go out and paint something or write a piece of music or sit in their condo and contemplate the world.
It's only for the elite.
Exactly. So one's like, kind of an immature, maybe a poor approach at life, and the other one is more like a rich, aristocratic, high-class approach to life. Oftentimes, those are the dichotomies that I think people think in generally.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. This book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, clearly Josef Pieper, if he's an intelligent guy, which we think he is not saying that the basis of culture is sitting on the couch not eating couch potatoes. That's typically a human being. Typically, you eat chips.
It's called cannibalism.
Chips when you're on the couch.
We don't recommend you eat couch potatoes.
We don't, or be a couch potato. Certainly don't eat couch potatoes.
Yes.
If you want to eat regular potatoes, go for it.
That's
in
right.
moderation, as in all things.
Couch potatoes, though, medium rare probably would be pretty good if I had to guess.
But we all know that the best form of potato is sweet potato.
I knew you were going with that.
You knew
dude.
it because it's true.
Some might say intuitive knowledge.
So it's interesting. Josef Pieper, he wrote this book, the historical context in which he wrote it. He's from Germany, right? And he wrote it after World War II. So Europe, Germany in particular, is in shambles, literally. I mean, the destruction that's taking place as a result of the fighting, and they're in this rebuilding phase. Mm-hmm. And supposedly, what Josef Pieper is responding to in this book is are the voices in his contemporary milieu that are saying, we need to work, do everything we can to rebuild this nation, our infrastructure, everything that's been destroyed. There's no time for things like the arts anymore. There's no time for things like philosophy, the humanities. Everybody needs to focus up. And if we're going to rebuild this civilization after the war, what we need to do is just work.
And it's interesting because the German people have this connotation, right? Like they're like super strict, and they're grammatically correct always, and they're the engineers, they're the ones that build society and the architects. And I wonder if it comes from this kind of attitude that pervaded in the 19th and 20th century in an attempt to rebuild Germany. I think rightly so. This desire to rebuild their own culture, their own society. But their emphasis, I think, was the wrong one. And I think that's what Josef Pieper was warning against. Hey, guys, if we only emphasize work, then we actually have a false attempt at rebuilding our people, at rebuilding society. And one of the things I think in the historical context of this book is that they were trying to equalize everybody. They didn't want the aristocrats who were thinking, who professed to be liberal artists. They didn't want those guys. They wanted everybody to together invest their time and efforts into rebuilding their country.
Yeah.
And instead of having the people who were writing philosophy or writing poems or artistic in any form of creative endeavors investing their time and effort, no, we should work to build a new country. And Josef Pieper's like, wait a second. If you actually want to build an effective and community and society of the heart.
And a culture, right?
Culture,
and
exactly.
A real culture.
And a culture that, Josef Pieper has an interesting idea of culture just to briefly touch about.
Please.
But there's like three principles that guide cultures. One of them is perception and value. So like environments help guide you into what is the highest priority of life. And then from those subsequent principles, all of the other categories fit into those highest principles, right? So we can talk hierarchy of being. You hear this all the time.
And of values, right?
Exactly.
My culture is going to teach me what's most important in life, in the world.
So one of the effects of culture is kind of this value system that is ingrained into you. But then there's also what he calls social agency, right? So there's community, friends, family, and then when he talks about like the priestly class or the priestly people, the teachers even, who instruct you, who hand you on tradition of knowledge, school, science, math, but then the liberal arts as well, who help, again, reinforce or conform you to this value system. And then above all is the influence of the divine.
In culture.
Right? So culture kind of plays this threefold purpose. It kind of gives you the value system of reality. It helps you engage the social life and really engage your nature, which is to be a social being, right? And confirmation with the local society and the larger society. But then it, above all, actually helps you engage God through others, through truth. So through value system, through people.
The word culture itself comes from the Latin cultus, which means worship. Right.
Important,
So
very important.
a culture is organized around that which it worships, that which it places as highest, that which is its highest value. And cultures are going to be better or worse to the degree that they conform to what is true, right? So you could have a culture that is toxic because it could place and inculcate really bad things, really evil things as the highest value, like racial purity, for example. If that is the highest value in your culture around which everything is organized, you're going to have a culture. People are going to be united around that ideal, but the culture is going to be terrible. But in any event, yes, the culture that he'll talk about culture involving these aspects and why it's so important. But he's saying really with this book, with this work, that Europe, Germany, if you want to have a culture at all, let alone a good culture, we need to carve out space in this rebuilding effort for what is truly human. And one of those things that is truly human is leisure.
Right. And it's interesting when he talks about this because he says, well, leisure just so happens to be not only a very good thing for society, but actually also a very effective thing for society.
Yeah, in a weird, paradoxical way.
Exactly. So anyways, I just thought an interesting note he brings forth too.
So one of the critiques, one of the ways he gets into this question, this tries to shift the perspective of his audience, is by posing this question: do you work to live or do you live to work?
I mean, to our listeners, you think about that question yourself.
Yeah.
How do you typically live your life? I mean, does your whole existence on a day-to-day basis surround the fact that you have work tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that? I mean, how often do you check your emails, for example, or your phone from workers, coworkers, bosses, peers? I know, reflecting on my life, it certainly consumes a major portion of my life. And in fact, even those activities that I hold to be leisurely, to be recreative, which we'll talk about later, oftentimes are influenced by this attitude of, I got to work.
I got to get stuff done.
Even like, hey, I got to go leisure so that I can be better at work. Right. And I think if we all reflect on that question that he poses, do you work to live or live to work? I think we can all kind of, we can all share in that sentiment that he's bringing forth, really.
Yeah. Now, the last thing that Max and I want to talk about or try to assert in this episode is that work is a bad thing. Work is not a bad thing.
It's not.
It's incredibly necessary. It's a fundamental part of every human life.
God worked.
God works, right? He does the work of creation and of salvation. But God also rests. And a lot of times we, in our workaholism that we can fall into, don't know how to rest and don't actually carve out space for rest or for leisure. So this question of, do you work to live or do you live to work? I mean, think about it. I think a lot of people completely define themselves in terms of their job, in terms of their occupation. In fact, one of the first things people will ask when they meet someone is, hey, what do you do? What do you do for a living? Not who are you? Not tell me about yourself, but what do you do?
What'd you major in?
Right. What are you concretely contributing to society?
And if the answer is, well, I studied music theory, I mean, instantly
you're like,
yeah, it's like, okay, guys. So like, what do you plan to do with that? Are you going to teach a high school band? You know, how do you plan to sustain a family then? You know,
yeah.
Or if a person says I study philosophy, you're like, well, good luck finding a job with that. But on the other hand, if somebody says I studied a servile art, I studied engineering, for example,
right?
They're like, oh, that's freaking awesome. I mean, we're talking about $90,000 a year starting.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, we place a high value on that monetarily and in terms of value.
Exactly. Accounting. I mean, so my point being that like this attitude, I think, pervades our culture as a people, but I think Josef Pieper is intuiting this in his own German people. I think it's pervaded other cultures. So,
and again, not to degrade or negate the importance of engineers.
And actually, engineers, if you have that money, please consider going to our Patreon and giving there. But the point being here, I think is pretty simple. I think we can all recognize that in ourselves, and it oftentimes damages families. I think if we're honest with ourselves, how many families are damaged by this kind of workaholic attitude?
Priestly vocations are damaged oftentimes because priests get wrapped up in this cultural stream, and they think if I'm going to be a good priest, I just have to be in the office doing paperwork, administrating the parish, rather than spending time in prayer and coming to know the Lord and then preaching the gospel.
And in fact, some of the best men I know and women I know how to leisure well. So they get their work done. Exactly. Yeah. They get their work done and they're also just happy. So,
but where does this Where does this attitude come from? Because it's not just present in post-World War II Germany.
It comes from sin.
Okay, yes, very
Okay,
good.
sorry. Anyways.
There it is. We're done. That's all you need to know. One of the places, I think this attitude has many roots, but one of the roots that Josef Pieper highlights is the thought of a guy named Immanuel Kant.
Emmanuel.
Who is Immanuel Kant?
He is a German philosopher.
German philosopher.
Is it 19th century?
He might be 18th century.
Okay.
Let me look. I can.
So he's going to look, but Immanuel Kant was deeply influential, especially in modern philosophy, right? So we have a period of philosophy where he was very deeply influential, and I think still carries a lot of weight. He's a serious contender in philosophy, and Josef Pieper is now kind of rebutting his arguments.
That's right. Immanuel Kant, April 22nd, 1724 to February 12th, 1804. So 18th century, died in the 19th century.
Boom, there it is.
But incredibly influential modern philosopher, an Enlightenment thinker who placed a high value on reason. And really, I mean, we should do a whole episode on Immanuel Kant sometime because of how influential he is. But a couple of the Kantian components, the Kantian philosophical aspects that Pieper highlights and zones in upon are Immanuel Kant thought that all knowledge, all human knowledge, is what in Latin is called ratio, ratio, ratio. So that is, I guess a good way to describe this is in the ancient world, there was this distinction. Human beings had this capacity to know.
Yes.
They had this faculty of reason. And that reason operated under two modes, according to the ancients, right? One of those modes was ratio. It was the active kind of hard work of reasoning from premise to conclusion that human beings do when they think through things.
We would say an inductive reasoning, right?
Inductive, or I think deductive, it applies as well.
Fair enough.
But it's when I am doing the hard intellectual work of solving a problem, reasoning from one thing to another, discursive reasoning we've talked about. So that is, human beings certainly do that. They have that capacity, and that's what we do. But the ancients also thought that human beings know things, exercise their reason under another mode. And that was, they would describe this type of knowledge as intellectus. Intellectus was not an active, laborious work. Intellectus was the capacity that man has to simply open his eyes upon reality and receive it and contemplate it, to be struck by what is given, what is there, and to kind of, without any effort, without any labor, grasp the essence of things.
Yeah.
Grasp what things are, the way the world is. Interestingly, the ancients would say that ratio is the more strictly speaking human type of knowing. So humans have both capacities, but ratio is the more human kind of knowing. Intellectus, human beings have, but that is more of it's more divine. It's more of a participation in the type of way that God knows things.
Correct.
Kant, in the 18th century, makes this move where he says, actually, intellectus, that's not a thing.
Not really a thing.
The only way that human beings know, or at least the only way that's worth knowing, is through ratio. It's through hard intellectual work. It's through reasoning from one thing to another to another. That is kind of behind some of these claims that are being made in the modern period about the necessity of work. We don't want to just look at the world and contemplate it as it is and receive it as a gift. We want to impose ourselves upon it. We want to do something with it. And unless we're doing something, what we're doing is not valuable.
Exactly. So all forms of knowledge then are reduced to activity.
Yes.
Right. And by extension, all sources of being are also rooted in activity. And I think that Immanuel Kant's proposition ultimately has both an epistemological way, it enforces upon us a certain way of thinking, of navigating the world, which is through active engagement, active mind on everything, an arduous sort of wrestling match with the world, but also an anthropological view. Who is man? Well, man is a type of man who thinks and works really hard in order to understand himself.
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, this Kantian view kind of possesses man. But then it's not just knowledge that's difficult for
That's
Kant, right? It's also virtue.
Yeah,
right.
This is so important. It's
And
related, but it's so important.
Exactly. And in the classical sense, and in the more Thomestic, we would say, or Aristotelian form of virtue, we would say, and as we mentioned numerous times in our project, virtue actually comes easily, right? The virtuous person, for example, when he sees a wallet, is not more virtuous because he struggled. He's like, well, should I take the wallet? Should I not take the wallet? Well, I think I see $100 in there. Should I take that? And if that said person decides to leave the wallet there, he's not the virtuous person. The virtuous man is actually the one who doesn't even pay attention to the fact that there's an abandoned wallet in the airport.
Yeah, he's not
Not even thinking about it. And in fact, he might be the one that picks it up and takes it to the front desk.
Promptly, easily, and with joy, we say.
So here we have, again, Kant proposing a certain way of who man is and how he thinks.
Yeah, so Kant proposes the opposite of that, right? Whereas someone like Aristotle, and then eventually the best of the Christian tradition, like
Correct.
Aquinas, all these people, they would propose that the virtuous man does what is good almost spontaneously, almost effortlessly. It just flows out of him naturally. And that's because he's worked hard at developing the habit to be able to do that. But when he's at his best, when he's practicing true virtue, he's doing it effortlessly. Mm-hmm. It flows out of him. Kant sees things differently. Kant thinks an action is valuable, is best, if it's really difficult to do.
And he has this idea that man should be motivated by duty. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what's also kind of behind all of these ideas, is that man should work from this motivation of duty. Where, again, we would say, as Christian people, we'd say, no, actually, we're motivated by love.
Yes.
By charity.
Yes.
And this is, again, two very different, I think, motivations.
So for Kant, the virtuous man is the man who grits his teeth, who clenches his fists, and works really hard to get something done. And the harder it is for him to do that thing, the better that action is.
Correct.
Whereas in the Christian tradition, we see things differently. And the reason is, I think this is the ultimate reason behind this dichotomy, is that in the Christian tradition, we have this understanding of a thing called grace. That we have something, well, really creation and then grace. We have a world that we are not responsible for creating. It's something that has been given to us. It's something that first and foremost we receive. Our capacity to act, our capacity to do good is not something that we summon up from within ourselves as though we have to be the architects of this world. It's something that is given to us by the God who is love. Kant doesn't have that perception. I think he was a Protestant Christian. I think he might have been a Lutheran.
Yes, I think he's Lutheran.
But so I don't know about all of his religious beliefs or whatnot. He was a Christian and probably certainly admitted the existence of a creator. But for him, practically speaking, human beings are the source of order. Even from an epistemological point of view, he would think that when we look at the world, we don't receive what's given. We impose our own categories onto the world, which is a whole other topic that we can get into another time. But for him, human beings are the source of really anything that's good, not God. We're not operating from a fundamental position of receptivity that we kind of build on top of. We're just operating full stop as the origin. And that is why, so some of his writings, which were incredibly influential in the 19th, 20th century, Pieper is now responding to. And he's trying to get us to say, no, look, we're not the source of everything. And if we try to behave like that, we're missing something, because we've been given a great gift that if we don't take time and set aside time to gaze upon in wonder, we're going to lose who we are.
Just a point of digression here, but I think it relates very closely to this,
please.
and then we can move on. Josef Ratzinger, very similar guys. And in fact, actually, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, was deeply influenced by Joseph Pieper.
Read a lot of Joseph Pieper.
And is cited in a lot of his works. But one of the things he talks about in his book, A Reason Open to God, it's a kind of a compilation of letters to different universities, different talks he's given to universities and professors and students alike. One of the things he says in his discussion to university professors in Madrid, interesting, he says something like, I am seeing a false dichotomy arise in the university systems. This dichotomy between what he says humanism and theism. As if to say, The universities are proposing to their students that in order to build a better people,
A fully human life.
a fully human life, a fully receiving truth that is due to them, in order to do so, we have to, on our own efforts, rebuild them.
And reject God, ultimately.
Exactly. Because he's saying, in the Christian view, however, we have humanism and theism coming together because our anthropology, our way of looking at the person, and our way of engaging the faculties of man is different than simply self-motivated, self-imposed, self-created beings. We recognize that we actually come forth from God. Yes. So in order to build a good people, a salvific people, a holy people, we have to have God. So you can't build a new society without God. But he says in the universities, there's this deep emphasis placed that in order to be a good person in society, a person who's objective is a person who's strictly focused on effort, strictly focused on their own forms of knowledge, strictly focused on their science and their philosophies, their own. Whereas theology or the sacred arts are left to a side, having no real connection to humanism in the secular sense. And so he's calling this out. And I think it's a similar dichotomy here that Kant builds.
Yeah.
Namely, that in order to build a new society, you don't need God. Well, he probably wouldn't say it outright like that.
Yeah. But people influenced by Kant were saying something.
We're saying something of the sort. And also, I think indirectly it says man doesn't have to be receptive to the will of God. Man doesn't have to be receptive to the knowledge that comes forth from creation. He actually has to impose it on the created world.
And this is, so yeah, the idea of atheistic humanism is really a contradiction in terms, because humanity cannot flourish without God, ultimately. If you try to take God out of the equation, if you try to take the creator out of the equation, the creature becomes unintelligible, as St. Pope John Paul II would say. I like to think of this, so, and this is what we're not saying. So obviously Kant places a high value on work, effort, exerting oneself, and that's important for Christians too, obviously.
100%.
But as Max said, it comes from a place of love. It comes from a fundamental place of receptivity. First you receive the gift, and then you cooperate with what you received and build that into what it was supposed to be in design, right? I think an analogy of this that I've been thinking about personally in my own life is when you incur an injury of any kind. Say you tear your ACL and then you have surgery, right? What happens is the principle within you, namely your nature, your soul, that organizes your body and that heals it by itself and that restores it to health, that's working before you do anything. That's working to restore strength to the muscles and to restore the tissues. So there's a force within you that you've been given, that you've been provided in by virtue of the fact that you are a human being, that with a human nature, that is working on its own, that you've received. But in order to expedite the process of healing, you actually have to cooperate. You have to get up and do exercises. You have to get up and move your leg, right? You do have to work, but you're working on top of something that's already working underneath you, namely this interior drive of your nature. And it's similar in the moral life. It's similar in, our lives trying to be good people. We do have to work hard, but we have to work hard cooperating with the grace that God has given to us. Okay, we said enough about that.
I think so.
Do we want to talk about briefly before we get into, so Josef Pieper's like, in response to this Kantian workaholism thing.
And also in response to false perceptions of what leisure is.
Yes. What we really need to build this culture, to build a true humanity, is leisure. Should we talk about that?
Yes, I think first just a little caveat here. One of the things that we've already talked about briefly, but I just want to reemphasize here, is the fact that he stressed the importance of the liberal arts. Yes, the servile arts are a necessary part of our society. We need them. We need good bridges. We need good, clean accounts, both at our homes, but also on the political scale. We need good budgeting. We need to be stewards of our money. But he also is saying that we need the liberal arts, right? Because the liberal arts temper this kind of animalistic drive to just work.
And I guess a helpful distinction, the servile arts are all those jobs, all that work, all those arts that are done for the sake of something else.
Yes.
Right? So I build a bridge for the sake of the productivity of the community, for the sake of transportation. I become an engineer and I do that type of work for the sake of, again, building things, whatnot.
Or making money.
Mm-hmm. Liberal arts are activities that are done for their own sake.
That's right.
They're not a means to a further end. So I engage in philosophy. I contemplate reality, not for the sake of making money, not for the sake of selling my ideas and getting a profit, but simply for its own sake, because pursuing the truth and being in awe and wonder of it is a good thing.
That's right. Now, that's not to say that at one time you couldn't make money doing those things. And in fact,
Right.
at the High Renaissance and the Renaissance era, it was very much a privileged task of work.
And yeah.
But, and it's also not to say that the person that's involved in these liberal arts shouldn't make money, shouldn't receive their just wage. But it is to say that the emphasis here is placed, one, as Joey said, on work as an end and one work as a means to an end.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it's funny you mentioned that because we've talked about this when we interviewed Matt Hylam, when we've talked to other artists. I think artists often find themselves in a dilemma when they do have to try to make money.
oh, that's a good point.
Using their craft, right? Because ideally, this liberal art, that whatever it's music, literature, poetry,
Grammar,
grammar, art, whatever it is, ideally that thing can be done for its own sake, so that the person can delight in it for its own sake. And so what becomes the temptation for someone who starts to make music for an occupation is that they instrumentalize what's not supposed to be instrumentalized. So that's a tension that they live within, right? They always have to be guarding against this. This is my art, this is my passion, and I love it. But now I'm using it to make money. I need to try to make sure that it remains something that I love for its own sake, which can be difficult. So yes, and so the servile arts, the liberal arts, this is an important distinction that Pieper makes. But let's get into really what is leisure. So we've talked about what leisure is not. It's not laziness. It's not idleness. It's not sloth. We've talked about this common workaholism attitude that Pieper is trying to combat. Now we should just talk about what is leisure. Like, what is true, authentic leisure, the way that Josef Pieper is envisioning it, and I would say the way the Christian tradition envisions it as well.
I think it's important to recognize that leisure here, properly speaking, is not an activity.
Okay, explain.
Right. He talks about the fact, here we have a book, if you want to, we'll put it in the link below. This is a copy we have. There's several other translations, but Joey and I both have the same copy. But one of the things he says is that leisure, it must be clearly understood, is a mental and spiritual attitude. It is not simply the result of external factors. It is not the inevitable result of spare time, a whole day or a holiday, a weekend or a vacation. It is in the first place an attitude of mind, a condition of the soul, and as such, utterly contrary to the ideal of worker in each and every one of the three aspects under which it was analyzed. Work as an activity, as a toil or as difficult, and as a social function. Right? So leisure, properly speaking, doesn't actually have a practical end. Leisure is an activity that is, first of all, a condition of the soul. It's not an activity. It's a condition of the soul, an attitude, a spiritual attitude towards the world, but that it's its own end. Mm-hmm. It serves no other purpose than itself.
So what that means is that if I want to engage in leisure, true leisure, the way that Josef Pieper is encouraging us to do, merely having free time is not enough.
That's right.
Merely having a weekend is not enough, because it's possible to go through that free time without actually ever cultivating this interior disposition, this condition of my soul that allows me to truly engage in leisure.
That's what we would also say something like, sorry to cut you off, but one of the things is like scrolling through TikTok all night isn't a form of leisure.
No.
It's strenuous, first of all, to the eyes, strenuous to the mind to take in all that blue light. But it's also, you're not also engaging your highest faculty, which is your soul, which is your spirit, which is your mind, your heart. You're not really engaging or comprehending, as you would say, apprehending reality. Mm-hmm. You don't have an openness to reality. You're taking in a very fixated, limited scope of a virtual reality.
And you're mindless as you're doing it.
Exactly.
Oftentimes.
So you're not really open to...
Which is why you don't feel rested and restored after you finish scrolling through TikTok for 5 hours, right? Because real leisure actually revitalizes us. But what that means is that we actually have to develop the capacity to engage in real leisure. It's something that we have to practice, and it's something, I think it's a gift ultimately that has to be given to us by God, this ability to what is, I guess, this spiritual attitude, Max? Say more about what leisure is.
So I want to touch on a point you touched on there at the end. I have found it very difficult to practice this, partly because leisure is hard to define.
Yeah.
Actually, and in fact, in the Greek, in the ancient Greek culture, they didn't have a word for not leisure. They only had a word for leisuring, right? Which is actually now the root word for what we use for school, leisure, schola in the German, and then school now in English. It was a place where you embrace reality. He has this analogy that, like, leisure is to time what a temple is to space.
Yes.
It's forming a place within you to be recreated. I don't know how else to explain it. The person who acquires leisure, it seems to me, is a person who's able to understand himself better, understand the world better, and understand God better. And some of the ways he can engage in this condition of the soul, or fostering this condition in the soul, is by engaging good, wholesome activity, reading, listening to good music, prayer, what we'll talk about later, worship above all to God, is what helps condition the soul in such a way that it not only can apprehend the good and reality, but it desires to be in constant contact with the truth of the situation, being as it were itself. And I know it sounds abstract, but those who have experienced this can tell you for a fact that it is in fact very calming, and it does in fact give you a sense of rest.
So leisure, I think that's very well said. You said leisure is to time what the temple is to space.
Yeah.
Right? So what is the temple? I mean, in any religious system, the temple, that building, is the place that is set aside and consecrated completely to God. It has nothing to do with the affairs of the secular world. It is totally and completely set apart for a divine purpose.
Yeah.
Right? It's not serving a utilitarian end in the economic system. It is its own entity. It's set apart. Josef Pieper says, leisure is to time what the temple is to space. Leisure is this time that we can set aside to dedicate to no utilitarian end, but merely for the purpose of what he says is affirming the goodness of reality.
Yep.
Right? So if I'm entering into the weekend and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to try to, I'm going to try to use this weekend so that I'm ready to work again on Monday, right? That's what this weekend is for, is getting me rested so that I can be a more efficient worker on Monday. It's like, okay, but yeah, maybe that's good, and you probably do need to get rested and restored for Monday, but if the activities that you're engaging in throughout the weekend are only done with that end in mind, then it's not true leisure.
In the same way that an example that comes to mind immediately is we all probably drink coffee. Most of us have drunketed coffee, for the sake of argument.
Yeah, I think that's right. Drunketed.
But I enjoy a cup of coffee when I'm actually just relaxing in the morning a lot more than when I'm having to tee up my Keurig so that I can get to my classes.
Right.
I think drinking coffee, I think listening to music and contemplating the books that I'm giving, the large amount of text that I'm required to read, is a great thing. But when I'm having to put all my energy in that for the sake of producing a paper, for the sake of making an A in a class or just passing the class, all of a sudden those things which are, I think, properly called to be leisureful are not.
The condition of soul changes.
It does. And you're not able to grasp things well. You're so scattered that you find it difficult to find rest. And so what you do oftentimes, I think, the person to cope with this scatteredness, with this fragmentation, he grabs his phone, he grabs whatever he can, he goes and takes pleasure in, I think, other things, other inappropriate things, other disordered things, in order to cope with this desire for his soul to be at rest. Right? And I think there is this kind of interesting play between restlessness and then rest that we're called to. Restlessness is something we all have. And I think in some certain sense, it's a good thing. It should propel us. It should motivate us to be in touch with Him who gives us rest. And it's something we desire. And it's when we're in touch with Him, when we're in touch with God, I say, but with being and with goodness, we actually experience and are motivated properly to Him, to being. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, so you said it. So if I'm engaging in this activity for the sake of a further end, then it's not true leisure. But also, there's also a impediment to leisure, namely an inability to be at rest with myself and an inability to acquiesce to the goodness of being is how Pieper puts it. But to experience reality and to affirm it as good and to immerse myself in it for its own sake, right? So what a lot of people do when they have some free time is they pull out their phones. Like we've said, they cannot allow themselves to just be. They cannot allow themselves to sit in silence or to just read a book and enjoy it for its own sake, or to listen to music and just enjoy it for its own sake, not background music so I can work on a paper while it's playing or so that I can get through this car ride, which is going to be boring, but like just to experience it in its goodness and to commune with it in a really real way.
Yeah.
So these activities, Pieper is saying, is if we lose them, not this leisure, this condition of our soul, if we blot this out from our culture, from our society, for the sake of merely working and producing more, we might end up with a really efficient industrial system, but it's going to be a system run by a bunch of people who don't actually they're not in touch with their humanity.
And who are requiring us to be working people all the time.
Who have lost themselves, who have lost their souls, who's lost the connection with the divine in them.
And with themselves.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that Josef Pieper is talking about and arguing for in this book, is that we need to reclaim leisure in order to build a culture, in order to be a properly ordered and well-grounded society. In order to find ourselves, we have to immerse ourselves in leisure. And in any culture you trace in history, they've always had, if you will, a leisurely people, right? You've always had the academies, the Jewish schools before that, the rabbis, right? The pupils, then the academies of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Then you had cathedral schools, right? Then you had monasteries, and now we have universities, right? Now, and we've had priests in different degrees and to different kinds throughout history. That our whole existence is to be immersed in being, to receive the knowledge. Again, going back to culture by just, as Josef Pieper, or as Joseph Ratzinger explains it, right? To receive the value system, to be in connection with others who know it and are trained by it and are helping form you in it, so that you can engage God properly. God who is being. I am who am, right? That's what God says. It's an interesting idea here. It's like, by conditioning our soul to be in touch with what's real, we're also able to hear the voice of God properly. And by doing so, actually be recreated in Him, and be directionally focused and unified. No longer the scattered idea of who you are and, fragmented vision of what reality is. In God, you're literally unified and directed to Him.
To the one.
To the one. You become one in the one, or a son in the son. I'm a rapper, honestly, if you really think about it.
So, okay. Oh, almost just spilled that water. Did spill a little bit of water.
On the new table, dude? Seriously. How dare you?
Okay, so I have two thoughts based on what you just said, and then we can get into the highest form of leisure. Okay, so that's where we should go after I say these two thoughts.
That's true.
My first thought is this.
Are we going to do it leisurely, or are we going to do it actively?
Jesus has this weird saying where he says, "Seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all these things will be given you besides." Right? This is such a weird, I love this scripture passage and I hate it because it's so hard. But basically what he's saying is, as a human being, don't pursue all these things that aren't the highest, thinking that they're going to fill you up, because you're going to get addicted to them. You're going to be disillusioned by them. They're not going to satisfy you. You're just going to want more and more and more. You're going to become frantic because the world is passing, and you're going to be filled with anxiety, and nothing in this world can satisfy you. So seek first the kingdom of heaven. And I promise you, if you entrust your heart to the Father and follow Him unreservedly, then all these other things which you wanted, but now you don't want as much as you want, God will be given to you anyway. So now it's like you're in this weird position where you're not seeking these things, but they're being given to you. But you love God so much that even if they were taken away from you, you'd be fine because you have what matters. Leisure is kind of like that with regard to the relationship between leisure and the rest of your life. It's kind of like seek leisure and the rest of your life will fall into place. And because of that, so what do I mean by that? All right, let me think, because this is a long thought that I'm trying to draw out. It's tempting to think, okay, if I'm going to live a fully human life, I need to work. I need to work really hard. I need to produce, and I need to make money and all these things. Okay, but if you do that, you're not going to be satisfied. You're not going to be fulfilled. So it's possible to be like, okay, I need leisure in my life. So I'm going to pursue leisure, whatever that is, for the sake of that work, right? I'm going to pursue leisure. I'm going to create time and space for this thing that people are calling leisure so that I can become a better worker. But then you're not seeking first the kingdom of heaven. Then you're not seeking first leisure. What it really should be is seek first leisure for its own sake, and then you'll notice that the rest of your life begins to fall into place. And because leisure, this is the second point I wanted to make, it becomes that time and space that you carve out in your life for leisure becomes the orientation of the rest of your life. It becomes the space towards which you are always tending and the source from which you are always drawing. So the perfect example of this is the Mass, and we can get into this, and we'll get to the fact that worship, spoiler alert, worship is the highest form of leisure, but Mass is that time and space where we're not doing anything productive, we're not doing anything to further the economy, right? We're just worshiping God. We're just praising God.
In community.
With
at the highest value, God.
Yes. And if I pursue that for its own sake, the rest of my life is going to come, it's going to fall into place. It's going to fall into order. And what's going to happen is even throughout the part of the work where I'm weaking, not part of the work where I'm weaking, even throughout the part of the week where I'm working.
That was fascinating.
Even throughout the part of the week where I'm working, I'm not going to fall into that workaholism because I know I'm tending towards this space of leisure, this space of worship, this space of communion with what is the highest. And that communion with what is the highest is going to seep into the rest of my life and infuse it in such a way that I can experience leisure, in a sense, even while I'm working, even while I'm in the ordinary flow of my day-to-day activities. So that's like leisure, worship, these things that we do for their own sake, for communion with God, for communion with what is good, true, and beautiful. They transform our lives in a way that our own efforts to transform our lives are insufficient to do.
And I think
that was a long thought. Thank you for bearing with me. Holy moly.
But it truly, it has a divine effect on us.
Yeah.
But it implies something cosmological, namely that we recognize that creation is a good thing.
Yes.
We recognize it as something to be immersed in. That we don't see it as something competitive or against us. That our neighbor is not just our enemy, right? That going away from work is not something that's harmful or traumatic. But that actually, first of all, creation is a good thing. It's something that we need to learn how to love, how to tend to. But also that engaging our neighbor is an act of faith, an act of trust at times. But it's someone worth investing in because they come forth from a gift, right? And at times it can seem difficult, and at times it is difficult, but it's worthy of us, right? It's worthy of us.
So what is the highest form of leisure according to Pieper, even though I already gave it away?
You did give it away, and this may seem like a jump to some listening, but if you consider what we just talked about, what leisure is, it's a condition of the soul so as to be able to apprehend reality.
And to affirm what is the highest and what is good, true, and beautiful.
What is true about you, what is true about the world, what is true about God, and beautiful and good. The highest form of leisure is worship. And it's interesting, Joey, as we were preparing for this episode, I was like doing some reading on worship because I said, okay, so for Josef Pieper, worship is the highest form of leisure, but what is this thing? One of the, I think, hermeneutics, one of the ways to interpret this that I found comes to me from Joseph Ratzinger. You heard of the guy?
I think I have.
Nice, well done. He says that he has this idea that worship is, and he draws on St. Paul for this. He reverts to the Greek, right? Logike latria. Another way we can translate this is logical worship.
This is from Romans 12:1. I urge you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies to God as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship, your literally logike latrie, logical worship.
He says worship in harmony with the eternal word and with our reason. If that doesn't blow your mind as you're listening to this, that's okay, because it's actually something hard to understand. But it should move you, it should motivate you to think, okay, worship is the unification, the integration of my being, of my mind, of my heart, and of my passions to the Word, to the Son,
to the Logos,
to the Logos, to the one who conditions us and prepares us to meet the Father. And so leisure is an anticipatory, a necessary attitude for us to have so that we can actually embrace God who is being, God who is reality, Christ who is the one who teaches us how to love and who to be. He is the worshiper that we're worshiping in.
Yeah.
And that's what I think worship helps us do. It rehabilitates us in a certain way.
And it literally, by definition, puts us in contact with what is the highest.
Exactly.
Pieper says that the highest, a characteristic of worship is celebration, right? So that's the feast day, Sunday, right? These things that are characteristic specifically of Christian worship, but really of all forms of worship in all religions, is this idea of celebration. When we celebrate something, when we have a feast, when we have a party, that is leisurely, if it's done with the appropriate attitude in mind, right? For its own sake, for the sake of communion with one another, with God. Because what we're doing is we're deliberately stepping away from that frantic flow of economic productivity, and we're just rejoicing in each other's presence. And we're just rejoicing in God's presence. And it doesn't matter. We're wasting time together.
And that's okay. We're all good with it.
And that's, by the way, another definition of prayer is just wasting time with God. Mm-hmm. That is one of the highest forms of leisure, of true leisure. Wasting time because you're not producing, you're not contributing to the economy in this moment. You're just existing and receiving yourself and being grateful for it and praising the one who gave you yourself and the world.
And also, although there's nothing maybe sometimes evidently happening, grace is still flowing within you.
Yeah.
The life of God is still unfolding within you. So there is this, again, dimension of where the visible and invisible come together in prayer and leisure.
And what is the fruit of leisure, Max? What's going to happen? What's it going to look like if we engage in it? If we carve out space for leisure in our lives? Certainly, I think every Sunday should be a day for leisure. That's what sanctifying the Sabbath, that's what resting in God looks like. Mm-hmm. It is engaging in true leisure, worshiping Him, obviously, first of all at Mass, but then also throughout the rest of the day, rejoicing, feasting, celebrating with friends and family, engaging in things for their own sake and not for the sake of some productive end. And then also throughout the rest of our day, throughout the rest of our week, incorporating leisure, incorporating prayer into our lives to the degree that we're able, depending on our state in life, depending on our job. What's going to be the fruit of that if we do those things?
Before we get into the fruits of leisure, let me bring up something that I think we forgot to mention that I think is going to help drive the fruits of leisure home. One of the things that Josef Pieper proposes to be kind of juxtaposed, maybe directly opposed to leisure, is acedia or sloth.
Which is funny because most people think that leisure is the same thing as sloth, but he actually says they're opposites.
Exactly. He says idleness, but then he says, no, actually, acedia is the enemy of sloth. And acedia or sloth actually is the sorrow that comes when faced with a spiritual good. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll try to keep it brief. When we know we should be doing something spiritual, whether it be prayer, I think leisure, it falls into that category, worship of God, love of neighbor. When we reject these things, that's properly speaking sloth, right? Many of us think sloth is just not doing something, just a lazy person sitting on the couch or whatever, avoiding helping with the dishes or the chores, whatever. That's not sloth. Actually, sloth can be qualified by the fact that a sorrow is a fruit of not doing the spiritual good, which in this case, prayer, worship, leisure, whatever, reading.
It too is a condition of the soul, right? Like
Right.
leisure.
Exactly, because you can be a person who works a lot and struggle with sloth, interestingly enough, because it's a condition. It's a form of being.
It's an impoverishment. It's an inability to affirm the goodness of being.
Correct. And so as a contrary, as an enemy to sloth or to leisure, we have sloth, which is rather than an embrace or an apprehension or a reception of reality, it's a negation. It's a rejection of reality for the sake of yourself. And the fruit of that is sorrow, sadness, a deep spiritual sadness. But one of the fruits of leisure, interestingly enough, because it's an apprehension of reality, because you see reality for what it is and you desire to be in contact with it, is happiness.
Joy.
Tranquility, peace. One of the qualities of leisure is actually a calmness of soul. And not just a yippee hooray, let's cheer and let's just like have a good time and drink whiskey kind of thing. That's a leisureful activity, I think, as well. But more properly speaking, it's a condition of the soul. There's actually a stability of happiness that exists within you that prepares you to recognize who you are, what creation is, who your neighbors are, and approach God with this joyful and docile spirit.
You know what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of the CFRs, those Franciscans, the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal. We had them on Logos Podcast a couple of years back for an interview, which was awesome. Every time I've encountered those guys, they are like, each one of them is like a small island of peace that just walks around. They just radiate peace and joy. And it's because they are so immersed. They spend so much time just before our Lord, gazing upon him in the Blessed Sacrament in true leisure, to the point where their entire lives are really characterized. They're never in a rush. They're always just walking around calmly. There's a tranquility about them, even in the hustle and bustle of daily life. They're just moving. They're recollected. They're, and this is the case of the saints. The saints, even in the midst of the busy tasks of day-to-day life, are somehow leisureful, are somehow, they're just affirming the goodness of being everywhere they go, and they're at peace with it. They're at peace with themselves. They're not anxious. They're not hurried. They just are.
And I think if you think about the saints, loosely said, in your own life, you'll recognize that one of the qualities they probably have, one of the conditions that they probably personify, is a leisureful condition. They have this attitude towards life. They don't take themselves too seriously.
Yeah, that's a big one.
You know, they receive what's given to them with love, with joy. And whether they have a lot or a little, they have a stability to them, a tranquil life, because they've immersed themselves in the leisureful life. And I do think, friends, this is really a new approach, a new vision of reality for a lot of us. It was for me when I first encountered this text, when I first encountered Josef Pieper's outlook and his philosophy, his theology as well. I think that was new for me, because we begin to see, we're actually drawn back into, sorry, I could go off on this, but we're drawn back into the beginning of salvation history, into the story of man. Namely, in the beginning, yes, our Lord works, right? Our Lord works and he creates the world, but then he rests, right? And so we too are called to work. It's true. Work is a dignified thing. It's a salvific thing. But actually the highest human activity is to rest properly, to be recreated in him, to be conditioned in such a way that we can actually embrace reality and offer it back to God.
I know that our listeners at some point in your lives have probably experienced, you've been granted some sort of free time, and you don't know what to do with it. And perhaps you hear the voice of Immanuel Kant, who you didn't even know was there, but it's him telling you, if you're going to be valuable, if you're going to be worthwhile, you need to do something. You can't just sit here and do nothing. Get off your butt and do something productive.
And unless you have a degree similar for maybe a student or a college or a young person, unless you have a degree, you're not worth anything.
And unless it's hard work, it's not worth doing. We want to challenge that. We want to invite you into leisure. We want to invite you to carve out space, certainly on Sunday every week, but then throughout your day-to-day life, carve out space for useless activities that are not laborious or difficult. Activities like prayer in its highest form, but then things like listening to music for its own sake.
I think listening to a good, like, wholesome podcast is a similar thing. It's
like
been
Logos
for me.
podcast.
Like
Just
Logos podcast
turn
is
us
the one.
on and just listen to us speak. No, but for real, just contemplating the truth, thinking about things.
Maybe there's that book on your shelf. You've had it there for 4 years, and you're like, I should probably pick it up. Maybe it's scripture. Maybe it's going to the gym again.
Yeah.
Maybe it's, I mean, there's all kinds of expressions, I think, of how leisure plays itself out practically, but things that you can rejoice in
For their own sake.
and condition you.
Not so that someone else sees me doing it,
Mm-hmm.
not so that I'm making money doing it, but because it's good and it's worth doing.
That's right. All right, guys. That's it. Just a little something. Not too much. I hope and I like to think that you have followed us all the way into this hour and 5-minute, 6-minute episode. I think you're going to benefit a lot from it. I sure did when I first was exposed to this text. But as we
Read the book
close
too.
off- Yeah, for sure.
Leisure, the basis of culture.
We'll link it below, and we promote it all the time. So, guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast. We hope you grew in relationship with the Word, with the Logos. As Joseph Ratzinger says, leisure, worship, is harmonious activity with the eternal Word, with our reason. So with that, as always, God bless.